A very warm welcome to this third workshop under the title Build Back Inclusively, that is on climate and disability. This session will be co-moderated by Mary Keel from CDM Global and myself, Mette Müller Christensen, Vice Chair of IDDC. Before we begin this interesting session, there is a few practical information. The link to captioning has been inserted in the chat box. If you have any problems, please write in the chat and we'll make sure everything is working. You also see sign language interpretation. And then I would encourage you to make sure that your name appears and the organization you are representing. And if you have questions, you can raise your hand under participants or write it in the chat box. Please know that the session is being recorded, so it can be uploaded on IDDC's YouTube page, YouTube channel afterwards. So that's a few of the practical information. I'll give the word now to Mary, the co-moderator, who will outline the purpose of the session, the program, and introduce the first two speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mette, and apologies to everybody because I've binging going on as I'm letting people into the room, so just bear with us as
we can't
if you hear the sounds.
It's only you who can hear it.
Okay, oh good, okay, thank you. So hi everybody, very welcome to this session. We're really pleased to see such a big audience coming. This is not a brand new topic for disability, but it's definitely a new and emerging one. And really keen to have a really good discussion today. So Mette and myself will try and be as entertaining as possible and moderate in an interactive way. But it's really very much over to our speakers and our colleagues from IDDC who will be sharing their experiences. So just really broadly in terms of the objectives of the session, before I outline how we will run the session, is first of all, the idea is to look at exploring the intersection of disability rights and climate change. It's to highlight activities by OPDs and IDDC at country level, at global level. And it's to discuss key areas for strengthening collaboration between the different stakeholders in the fight against climate change. I think all of the speakers today will speak to the impact of that. How this session is going to run is we will have two keynote speakers speaking first of all. So I will introduce both of these colleagues now. And then we will move to a panel discussion where myself and Mette will co-moderate 3 rounds of questions with colleagues to draw out the experiences and to highlight kind of key areas of work. And then we will open it out to you to come in with questions, and we really hope for a very interactive panel. I'm looking forward to it today. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over first of all to our colleague Elham Yousefian from the International Disability Alliance, who is going to start the session with giving us a kind of an overview from the perspective of the global perspective and from OPDs with climate change. Elham, thank you for joining us so early in the morning, New York time. We're really pleased to have you and we look forward to your intervention.
Thank you very much. Hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It is my pleasure to be with my IDDC colleagues. Many of you, I have worked with you on different projects, and it's exciting to be here again to discuss a new thing. I don't think I have discussed this with many of you, so I'm so excited that we can talk about climate change and disability today, and very appreciate this opportunity to be with you today. So what I would start with is that this is a real problem, the impact of climate change on persons with disabilities. It is not really documented, and there have been some research work going on, which colleagues will touch on later. But what we know is that people with disabilities, 80% of people with disabilities live in poverty. And we also know that the more poor you are, the more likely you experience the impact of climate change, and the less likely you have been contributing to that. So I can safely say that people with disabilities are among the most impacted by climate change, while have played the least role in climate change. Many disasters these days are caused by climate change. Sea rise and all over the world, we know that this is a huge problem going on. And honestly, the level of the problem is not even clear for the scientists. But what we know is that global problem that impacts everyone. Some people experience the impact in a more obvious way because they see that their house is going under the water. Some people experience it less. They feel that there's no more rain. They experience the heat wave. They experience all the problems of losing the nature around them. So, but the reality is that everybody is experiencing the impact of climate change. But for people with disabilities, for the reason of poverty that I just mentioned, plus the reality that unfortunately the disaster preparedness and response plans and programs are not really inclusive and accessible for persons with disabilities. So they're more likely to experience hard impact of climate change. So we know that, for example, people with disabilities are 2 to 4 times higher likely to die because of the disaster. When their displacement happens, they're more likely to have to leave their houses, while at the same time, it is very difficult for them to move. So they have to experience displacement, and we know that in many situations, they face difficulties, they're being left out. So I was in a meeting with colleagues from the Asia psychosocial groups, the TCI Asia colleagues, consulting them about the impact of disasters on persons with psychosocial disabilities. And I was shocked when I heard that many people with psychosocial disabilities are left out when the rest of the family are evacuating or leaving because of the disaster, because they feel that it's difficult to take them together with the journey, or because they're shackled, and many other reasons. And even when they are joining the journey, it's still difficult because most of the time the wheelchairs are not taken, the other assistive devices are left behind. And then another impact that I want to touch on is impact on livelihoods. Many persons with disabilities lose their jobs first when the disaster impacts, because they work in the informal sector. So of course it is yet to be documented. I know that my colleagues in the Pacific Disability Forum have conducted a research on impact of climate change in 3 countries there. Other things are going on. We have Yolanda, who will also talk about what McGill University has already done. But still, research needs to be done in this regard. And I want to use this opportunity to encourage colleagues that have research agendas on their organizations to look into documenting the impact of climate change on persons with disabilities. So yeah, first layer of the conversation is that climate change does impact for persons with disabilities, or as I call it in an event that I'm organizing, climate change is for us too. Yes, climate change is for persons with disabilities as well as others. It's not that because we have disabilities, we are exempted from climate change. Then the next layer of the discussion is that we can actually play a role, and we must play a role This is a global problem for humanity. The whole humanity is being impacted by climate change. And this is very serious. We know that if we don't do anything about it in the next 10 years, 20 years, the whole humanity is going to be in danger. So why we should leave 15% and doing their responsibility. So I would say that, yes, we do have a role to play, and the society, the governments should prepare what is required for us to play the role, because this is a must. This is a serious problem. So there is no way for people with disabilities to be excused. And we don't want to be excused. We are equal citizens. And here is the example of where we start seeing that, yeah, most of the climate actions and actions that people can take to combat climate change is not really inclusive and accessible. It's not inclusive because sometimes the plans are made without considering rights and requirements and needs of persons with disabilities. So for example, we see that they're planning for green jobs, but how are they really considering impact of this creation of this green jobs on people with disabilities? Are these green for the disabilities or not? Or for example, we see that they're planning for carbon emission, reduction of carbon emission. And then again, many of these plans are not accessible, are not inclusive. You can remember the famous example of plastic straws in New York City. So just last week, we got a new, finally, after a few years of disability activists in New York, fighting that, yeah, you cannot ban single-use plastic straws because some people with disabilities rely on them to eat and drink, because paper straws are not work for them. They are not flexible, they're not bendable, and they dissolve when they're exposed to liquid for a few minutes. So now the new order is that all shops should keep some plastic straws handy, and upon request and without mentioning the request reason, it should be provided. I hope that scientists start working on a new product that is as flexible as plastic straws and is not as dangerous as plastic straws. But until then, we can deprive people with disabilities from the right to eat and drink independently just because we want to save the environment. So here is one example of why the consultation did not happen in the beginning. So yeah, we need to be given the opportunity to play our roles. And then final layer is that we can actually be helpful, and we can provide good solutions. So one example that I was giving here is how you can use disability rights arguments actually in favor of climate change and in favor of disability. So one way of helping the environment is transportation. So if we make the public transportation accessible for everyone, including persons with disabilities, then that would mean that people with disabilities can travel independently. So this is a win-win for both sides. And I always recommend to colleagues with disabilities that we can go to transportation management people and tell them, hey, if you make the transportation accessible, that would mean that we will be able to achieve our independence and also contribute in the global movement to save the environment, to save the earth. So I myself, for example, always feel bad that I cannot use the subway in New York City because it's not really accessible, and I have to use taxi. So we can provide solutions. At the same time, it is very well known that people with disabilities, because of the whole battle in life that we had to fight, we're oriented. Whenever we face a barrier, the first reaction is to find a solution. And I think that's exactly what we need in a global climate battle, that we all have to play, because we can always be very creative in finding solutions. So including people with disabilities in global climate action is necessary, is not excusable, and is helpful. So the rest is on us, as wherever we stand as organizations of persons with disabilities, as development organizations, as research organizations, to look at our policies, programs, plans, and see how we can contribute in this in global movement, and how we can make sure that people with disabilities are protected, included, and can participate. Thank you so much, Mary. I hand over back to you, and happy to participate in further conversation.
Thank you so much, Elham. And maybe just to pick 3 key points before I move on to Yolanda, and just to say to everybody, there will be room and opportunities for questions. But I think your 3 layers of, climate does impact persons with disabilities, and your key message that, persons with disabilities have contributed the least, but also are impacted the most by climate change is really critical. The fact that OPDs must play a role, I think, we'll speak about that a little bit further and expand on that. And then also looking at the providing solutions, and that's also something we will discuss later. So thank you, Elham, for that input. Next is our second keynote speaker is Dr. Yolanda Muniz, from the Disability Inclusive Action Research Program with McGill University. And Yolanda is the coordinator of the outreach and policy activities with McGill. And Yolanda, we're very happy to have you here with us today to talk about the whole area of how knowledge is really important in capacity building for this area of climate and disability. So Yolanda, over to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you very much, members of the International Disability and Development Consortium, for having me here today. And well, as Mary mentioned, I am currently collaborating as part of the Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program. I am a scholar and an advocate with a disability myself. And I am going to talk about this small journey that we had started, that started several years ago, to make connections between disability rights and environmental justice and climate action. To start with, I will give you an overview of the present situation of the challenges and opportunities ahead to advance disability rights in the dialogue on climate change. At the international level, persons received minimal attention in this dialogue that started in 1994 with the adoption of the Convention on Climate Change that I will refer to as UNFCCC, that is the regular name for economy of language. And NGOs from around the world have joined the conversation as observers and are currently grouped in 9 constituencies. That is the business and industry, environmental, third farmers, then indigenous peoples organizations, municipal authorities, research, and independent NGOs, and trade union NGOs, women and gender, and finally youth NGOs. So as you can perceive, disability is not among these constituencies, despite the social inequality who already are facing extreme poverty and malnutrition ongoing, and plans for the creation of a caucus are underway. A first milestone to include disability in the dialogue on climate change was the preamble is the preamble of the Paris Agreement, which is a legally binding international treaty on climate change. It was adopted by 196 parties at the Conference of the States Parties, COP 21 in Paris in December 2015, and entered into force in November 2016. And although most of the signatories of the Paris Agreement have also signed and ratified the CRPD, meaningful inclusion of people with disabilities at the in-country climate action strategies remain lukewarm or completely absent. According to our research by our director, Professor Sebastian Jodouin, and his team, there are 39 countries with at least one climate adaptation policy that mention people with disabilities, while there are only 9 countries with at least one policy document mentioning people with chronic illnesses. Most of these documents are in Europe and in sub-Saharan Africa, but the rest of the world is still, we're talking about a handful of countries. And to make things even more complicated, all of these policies simply lump people with disabilities in a list of vulnerable groups. They also use the medical model and make no reference to disability as a human rights concern. There are also no specific measures to enhance the climate resilience of people with disabilities, and no, there is no evidence that people with disabilities have been consulted in the development or should be consulted in climate adaptation strategies, which means that we are considered as passive recipients of help and not as problem solvers, as Ilhan was mentioning. And also, of course, this goes against the obligation of states parties to consult us in every aspect that is related to our life. Now, moving forward, also in 2015, of course, was a key year for our inclusion, not only in the Sustainable Development Goals, that also consider climate change, although we are not specifically mentioned in that target, and but also the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030 is a very important document for us to advocate for inclusion in case of emergency. Later on in 2019, another key document was produced by the International Labour Organization, that is the policy brief, Persons with Disabilities in a Just Transition to a Low Carbon Economy. And this is very important because for the first time, we are expanding our perception of climate change only as natural disasters or weather events. No, it's like moving forward, what's going to happen with transportation of people with disabilities? How precarious it is the situation of people with disabilities in the transition to a low carbon economy. And this is a document that we need to keep always in mind to produce knowledge. Later, in April 2020, the UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights published the analytical study on the rights of persons with disabilities in the context of climate change, which is available online. This is a very important document because it's, of course, the most recent one, and also it has an easy to read version that I strongly recommend you to read and study. And this launching of this document was also accompanied by with a Human Rights Council panel discussion on the rights of persons with disabilities in the context of climate change. where experts and people with disabilities in general urged the state's parties to take action on meaningful inclusion of people with disabilities in the strategies to mitigate the effects of climate change from a human rights perspective. Meantime, at the grassroots level, there were some donors that were trying to connect the dots between disability rights and environmental justice and climate action. And one very specific example that I can quote is Global Green Grants Fund. Global Green Grants Fund has awarded more than 250 small grants in several countries since 2018. I had the opportunity, I still have the opportunity to participate in this process of building bridges between movements, and I have trained them on anti-ableist practices in grant making, and everybody was very receptive to this idea of welcoming people with disabilities, of creating inclusive projects related to reducing the impact on human rights of everyone related to environmental degradation. But we found an unexpected obstacle. That is that organizations of people with disabilities at the grassroots level did not want the grants because they felt intimidated by the idea of making connections between disability rights and climate justice, because they didn't have the knowledge. And we realized that we had skipped one step, that is building capacity of the organizations of people with disabilities to better understand why climate change matters, why climate change needs to be addressed as a priority in their agendas. And at this point, Sebastian Jodouin, who had been working for more than 15 years on the field of international law on human rights and climate change, and we discussed this gap that is still existing, and that he has addressed at the academic and international level, but that I also have had the chance to work with at the grassroots level through my participation with Global Green Grants Fund. And this is why we decided to launch the Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program. And thanks to the support of an advisory panel conformed by advocates with disabilities and academics interested in the subject, we wish to produce the necessary knowledge to help disability rights promoters to develop solid advocacy platforms to ensure meaningful inclusion at the international, national, and local levels. And of course, as academics with a disability, our goal is to serve the community by providing information and facilitating the dialogue between movements to the best of our capacity. And today I wish to encourage you all to learn more about the relationship between climate justice and disability rights. This is a very new field of action, as we have already said before, and the opportunities for doing participatory research, in my opinion, are very exciting, because there's everything that needs to be done. And as persons with disabilities, we must be proactive to attain meaningful inclusion in this dialogue that concerns us all. As Elham mentioned, we are creative problem solvers, and we have a strong sense of resilience. And at the same time, environmental activists, you will be surprised, but they are very receptive to incorporating disability rights in their agenda of priorities. But what we have to avoid is that disability remains an afterthought. By improving our own knowledge on the subject, it will become more evident that including disability as a central issue, as a priority, will represent an asset to better understand multiple forms of privilege and oppression, as well as multiple opportunities for building a better society for all. Thank you very much.
Yolanda,
that's all.
Thank you so much for taking us through that. Just some key points, I mean, really important, critical points around disability and persons with disabilities not being visible within kind of the climate policies and adaptation approaches and how that needs to change. And obviously COP is coming up this year and we can have that conversation a bit later on. I think your points around the intersection of working with environmental activists is really critical and how we can think through that. And also the intersections of the intersectionality of disability and climate change and the whole perspective of power and privilege, I think is something that is something also really critical to discuss. So thank you to both our keynote speakers, both to Elham and to Yolanda, for taking us through that kind of whirlwind overview perspective. What we wanted was to frame the discussions that we will have. And I'm now going to hand over to Meta, who's going to take the first round of questions with some of our other colleagues who joined us to speak from a country perspective. Over to you, Meta.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you, Yolanda and Elham, for really setting the scene and painting the overall picture. I thought that was very informative. What we have now are three guests, three colleagues, who will each share perspectives from their own experience in their countries or regions, how they have worked with climate change and disability. And the first one that we have is Dr. Bhushan Punani. Are you with us?
Yes.
Dr. Bhushan? Yes, brilliant. I see you now, the camera is on. Excellent. And I know you're the president of the ICEVI West Asia.
Yeah.
And I'll give you the word just now, but if you could please share with us the work that you are doing related to climate change and how the work started. And also in India, how big a priority is the work on climate adaptation, and what is there any focus on disability inclusion?
Thank you very much, Mette. Good afternoon to all the participants. First of all, I bring you greetings of Dr. Francis, our president, Dr. Mani, CEO, Nandini, Parveena, and Rima, our principal officers. Thanks to IDDC to give us the opportunity to speak about climate change. It started with the earthquake of Gujarat, which was the most devastating earthquake ever this country had, killing thousands of people. And our organization, Blind People's Association, which is a partner of CBM and is the lead disability development organization in this part of the world, started working. And we have a permanent center, which is for the rehabilitation and looking after climate change, how we can contribute. And there we work closely with CBM, Merlin, WHO, UNICEF, International Red Cross, Guy Johanniter, European Union, European Red Cross, for providing relief to the people who are affected due to this earthquake, and which resulted due to a lot of things happening in this country. And outcome was we established a permanent relief center, which provides services to people with disabilities. And our work on the committee, which was headed by Handicap International, we prepared guidelines for the disaster preparedness, and which focus on that how climate change can affect more disaster and how we should be prepared. And I've been the visiting faculty on a disaster relief management program in this country, and I have presented a few papers in India, Tajikistan, and we worked very closely when there was a flood of Nepal, Sri Lanka, tsunami, etc. That's how we started. And then as I mentioned in my write-up, see, basically now we are working also on the COVID in a very big way. We are trying to provide the oxygen support medicines and all. And when I'm talking to you this moment, our country is very badly, I should say, impounded by Taute, the cyclone, which is the direct outcome of climate change because of overheating of the Arabian Sea. We have these type of cyclones. And I saw myself yesterday the impact of a cyclone. 100,000 people have become homeless, and thousands of people with disabilities have no shelter, have no food, and are suffering. Even our Prime Minister has to fly to see that how we should control these cyclones and what role we should play in the climate change. And that's what we are trying to do. And if you see further down, sorry, I like to move in my, you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can see your notes.
Yeah, in fact, I want to go down something. Okay, it's not, yeah, it's there. Yeah, thank God. Now, basically, when I come to the effect of the climate change on people with disabilities, I like to share with the panelists that there's a direct correlation between poverty and disability. And as the climate change affects poor people very adversely, those people with disabilities are bound to suffer due to their poverty, lack of resources, lack of knowledge, lack of employment. All these factors compound the effect of climate change on people with disabilities. The disasters resulting from climate change can cause variety of disabling conditions. We have seen ourselves. These conditions like loss of limbs, spinal injuries, eye infections, psychological disorders, and psychiatric manifestation. All these are outcomes of very disaster which result from the climate change. And the biggest challenge is evacuating people with disabilities when the disaster comes, and how to take them to a safer places, because they have restricted mobility and they need special lifting arrangement. And the basic thing, there's a delay in getting warning signals. And most of the countries in my part of the world do not have a special mechanism where people with disabilities can get signals like anybody else. And this causes excessive damage and loss of life to people with disabilities. And then the biggest problem is reaching them the relief services. Once the disaster is there, taking relief services is a very big problem. And they lose their orthoses, prostheses, rehabilitation, and assistive devices. And these disasters cause adverse effect many a times, which is irreversible on the health and well-being of people with disabilities. And you see, because of the climate change, and there are a few examples, I just like to quote a few examples. We have pollution in Delhi, 3 months of winter. You can't even stay there. People with disabilities have all sort of asthmatic problems, other problems. Delhi becomes so bad. It becomes the most polluted city in the world. And that's because of the climate change. Then the floods in Sri Lanka, tsunami in Andaman Nicobar, floods in Kathmandu, Assam, Bihar, Kerala, Karnataka, floods in Pakistan and Srinagar, frequent floods in Tajikistan. Almost every year there are floods in that country. And there are sliding of the rocks in Himalayan regions, which affects Nepal, India, and many other countries in the Himalaya region. And then there's a glacier burst. If you saw a few months before, there's a glacier burst because of climate change. And the effect was all people with disability in that area, they were marooned, they were left on the mercy of the people, and they found it very difficult to survive. And as you see, we have a number of cyclones because of the overheating of the Arabian Sea. These are Fani, Nisarga, Bulbul, Lilopur, and the one happened yesterday is the Taute. Because when the surface heats up and the cyclones result and they cause devastating effect, and people with disabilities are worst affected, and a lot of disabling conditions emerge because of eye infections, etc. Now, coming back to while floods, tsunami, sliding rocks, and drought are common in many countries, the pollution in Delhi, glacier burst in Himalaya, and disaster cyclone are the most disastrous outcome of the climate change. It is established by research studies that all these cyclones are the outcome of the climate change, and they're resulting into loss of life to people with disabilities. Now, coming to your second part, Mette, about what priority is being given to the work in India. I'm very fortunate that our government is very sensitive about disability. We are one of the few countries where we have established a National Disaster Management Agency, which is very inclusive. It involves people with disabilities also, and they have developed the guidelines. In the training module, they cover people with disabilities, and we have prepared the disaster preparedness guidelines, which covers people with disabilities also. And our government has promoted a strategic agency that works towards awareness creation and low carbon development, and that covers people with disabilities also. It has established a national network on reporting level of pollution, monitoring, and other indicators of climate change, which is a welcome step. It has also evolved and implemented a number of legislation. I'm very happy that I was a member of the drafting committee. We are one of the few countries which has a law which says that when it comes to affect the climate change and disasters on persons with disabilities, as I said, India is one of the few countries which has a national law, and which says the person with disability shall have equal protection. I underline shall have equal protection and safety in situation of armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies, and natural disasters. All these are outcome of the climate change. So our law says people with disabilities should have the equal protection and safety, and the national state disaster management authorities shall take appropriate measures to ensure inclusion of people with disabilities in its disaster management activities for their safety and protection. I like to highlight, as our speakers were saying, key speakers, the key words are their safety and their protection, which is being focused upon. And then we have a disaster management authority at district level, which maintains records of people with disabilities and informs them well in advance when the disaster is likely to take place because of the new signal systems now. The authorities engage in reconstruction activities subsequent to any risk, armed conflict, or natural disaster shall undertake, very important, such activities in consultation with the State Commissioner of Disabilities in accordance with accessibility requirement of people with disability. Mete, just to conclude, to answer your two questions, that we have a law, but I must tell the law is one thing, but implementation is the other thing. How effective the law is implemented is a question mark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhushan. This was really interesting with all the tangible examples from West Asia, and also the second part about some of the steps that has actually been taken. And of course, we all know that one thing is having the laws and the policies, another thing is implementation. Maybe that will be the next round of discussions we'll have. But thank you so much for your contribution for now. Now I'll move on to our second speaker, who is Sikai Zacharias, joining us from Mozambique. He's the country director of Light for the World. And I actually have the same two questions for you. If you could share with us the work that you're doing related to climate change and how the work started, and also if it's a big priority, the work on climate
speakers. My name is Zacharias Sikai. I'm the country director of Light for the World, country office Mozambique. Light for the World is a global disability and development organization, and we have been noticing gradually that in our focus countries, such as Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, Mozambique, and South Sudan, the climate change has brought direct impact in the right of persons with disabilities, and it has been mentioned in the presentation. Climate change exacerbates extreme weather events, which are the driving factors for increased migration of persons, and because the ability to migrate often depends on resource and mobility, Persons with disability have been facing many challenges. In Mozambique, in 2019, Mozambique was hit by Cyclone Idai, which was categorized 4 and was a very strong cyclone. And the person with disability were hugely affected by this cyclone. And we had over 400 humanitarian organizations that came to Mozambique to support the government to mitigate and rescue the affected people. And we as Latford, we noticed that no one of these humanitarian organizations prioritized person with disabilities. And this situation, we noticed because from the accommodation centers, the resettlement sites, person with disability were not prioritized. And we had to work with the government and with the DPOs, with the disabled people organizations. So to make sure that we could raise the awareness about the need for the inclusion of persons with disability in the emergency response. So together with the disabled people organizations, we created a disability working group, which this disability working group was part of the protection cluster under the UN emergency clusters, so that we could raise the awareness raising, we could bring information about how to include person with disability in the humanitarian response. I can tell you that in the first months of the humanitarian response in Mozambique, only 1% of the more than 100,000 persons with disability affected by the cyclone were not included in the humanitarian response. So it was really many people were left behind at community level, and the accommodation centers that were created were not designed in inclusive manners. The access of information was not inclusive. The food distribution was not done in an inclusive manner. So, what we have seen is really that many of the humanitarian organizations do not know how to include persons with disability in their programs. And the first question that came up was where we are going to find a person with disabilities. So what we always recommend is that this is really extremely important, that in humanitarian response, it's very important to include the organizations of persons with disabilities, so that you can be able to find where are persons with disabilities. Even at the community levels, persons with disabilities, they had a lot of struggle because of the accessibility. The cyclone destroyed the roads and it became inaccessible for persons with disabilities to move. So that's why we encouraged many organizations, with humanitarian organizations, to really work together with the DPOs to ensure that persons with disability can be included in the humanitarian response. Besides that, also, we started to work with the government entity that are responsible in humanitarian response, because we could see that there was no data about how many people with disability has been affected. So we started to work together with also the government entity to ensure that the data collection also take into account the Washington patient groups to make sure that persons with disability also can be counted in terms of statistics when they collected data on person affected by the cyclone. So this also is really very important that we ensure in terms of data collection that persons with disability also are being counted and are part of the statistics, because otherwise it will be very, very difficult for the humanitarian organizations to plan their response taking into persons with disability. If the statistics themselves that the government are providing for the different humanitarian organizations in terms of the number of persons affected by the disaster, if there's no number about person with disability, likely person with disability are going to left behind, because the response is not going to be designed taking into account the number of person with disability affected by the disaster. Additionally, we as Light for the World also, we designed a package of trainings for humanitarian actors, because it was very common to hear when we were participating in the humanitarian clusters, the UN clusters, where different humanitarian organizations were attending, like WASH cluster, food insecurity cluster, protection cluster, shelter cluster, and others. It was very common to hear from different humanitarian actors saying that we don't know how to include person with disability. So we designed a package of training on how to include a person with disability in a humanitarian response, in an emergency response. And we started to provide trainings to different humanitarian actors on how to include person with disability in their different emergency response projects or activities. So this is also was very crucial, because beyond of being training as such, there also the training also as a way of awareness raising for the needs for inclusion of person with disabilities in a humanitarian or emergency response. So this is something that we are still doing until now. We are still supporting different humanitarian organizations in terms of providing inclusive emergency response package training. We are working with the government entity in terms of, because the government has a different levels, different layers of emergency response, from community level to the district level to the provincial and regional levels. So what we are doing is really to train the government staff, so for them to understand how to include a person with disability in emergency response, from preparedness, early warning, accessible information to the community level, to the person with disability. And also we have made sure that the person with disability are part of the different disaster risk management committees that the government has created. So to ensure that person with disability also are part of this disaster risk management, so that we can ensure that the emergency response is designed taking into account person with disabilities. And as Mozambique is prone to the disaster, for us as Light for the World, climate change is really priority for us to ensure that our partners, persons with disabilities, are aware and are included in a humanitarian response when a disaster happens, or when with an extreme situation that is created by climate change. It can be a drought, it can be a disaster like cyclone, can be a flooding. So all this situation that's are very common in Mozambique, we need to ensure that persons with disability are not left behind. So this is what we have been doing, and we will continue doing. And we are very happy also to see that some international NGOs like Humanity and Inclusion, like UN agents like UNICEF, are on board together with Light for the World, bringing this topic to the different humanitarian actors, bringing this topic to the EU, bringing this topic to other bilateral and multilateral donors in Mozambique, so that it's important that in different programs that are designed and also emergency response programs, they include the person with disability. And just to finalize, we did a study just to assess how far persons with disability were included in the humanitarian response. And it was not a surprise for us as Light for the World, but for many different organizations, what is a big surprise to see that from this study, it was very clear that persons with disability were not prioritized. in the humanitarian response. The reasons for that was the different humanitarian organizations came over, and they normally don't think about a person with disability. And they think that including person with disability is extra cost. So that's why from these studies, we did a huge dissemination of these studies so that the different humanitarian organizations can really understand that if we want to make a sound emergency response, it's really extremely important that we take into account persons with disabilities, women and girls, elder people, and other vulnerable groups, so that our emergency response can be inclusive. And just to final remarks, we are happy as Lat for the world that we are still have a great collaboration and partnership with UNICEF and with other disability like-minded organizations like Humanity Inclusion, Site Savers as well. So we're working together, and the experience from our work as Light for the World, we are scaling up at national level as to create a disability working group within the humanitarian clusters, so that also we can have the topic of disability inclusions being spotlighted in the emergency response. So this is what the experience that I wanted to bring in this session. Thank you so much. And I hand over to you, Matt.
Okay, thank you so much, Sukai. It was really interesting to hear some examples from Mozambique and the cyclone Idai, and how you work with it. And I think this also brings forward what Bhushan was talking about, how there's some way from the big policies and from the YESC guidelines, for example, and then on how it's being implemented when a cyclone hits. Is it actually possible for do the humanitarian organizations, do they have the right tools and knowledge and data to actually be inclusive? So thank you very much for your presentation. I think we need maybe 2 or 3 or 4 hours more for this session, but we'll have to make a version 2 of this this workshop to include all the different aspects. For now, I'd like to hand over the word to Nadia Haddad, who is on the board and executive committee member of European Disability Forum. So moving from the country examples to that of the EU. And if you could elaborate on initiatives for climate funding that are really important. And the EU announced the new EU Green Deal. So if you could share about EDF's thoughts on the Green Deal and why it's so important to be disability inclusive. And also your thoughts on how EDF members and partners in the EU can bring influence to ensure the rights of persons with disabilities are included in the EU member state national plans on climate change. Nadia, I'll give the word to you.
Thank you very much, Mitty. Thank the organizers to have EDF with you today. So I'm glad to present a little bit our reflection about the European Green Deal that is addressing transport, built environment.
Is it possible for you to turn your camera on?
Yes.
Okay, great.
But I cannot because the host has stopped it.
Okay, we'll make sure that it works. You just continue speaking. We'll see if we can fix it. Thank you.
Okay. So within the European Green Deal, they're mentioning a lot about addressing transport, built environment, for example, virtual environment and communication. And if they are not accessible, more than 100 million Europeans with a disability, they will be excluded completely. So for us, it's really important that we have 4 pillars that we rely on. So the first one is accessibility, is a right in itself, but also precondition for accessing other rights. So in many cases, separate provisions need to be, okay, I can start my video, I see. Okay, it's working now?
Excellent.
Okay, thank you. So as I said, in many cases, separate provisions need to be made for persons with disability due to inaccessibility. So these are more expensive and less sustainable than accessible solutions. So that's why included accessibility from the beginning in the planning and the concept phase reduce the cost and leads to a better outcome. A second thing that is really also within the deal is smart and sustainable mobility. So when investing in intelligent transport systems, or when focusing on rail or air travel rather than air travel, measures need to be taken to make the rail also accessible for persons with disability. So this will allow passengers with disability to make sustainable choices, such as switching from using a private car to rail travel. Special attention shall be paid to make rail travel accessible and affordable for everyone, independently from their support needs. And the third point is also to strengthen the social, human rights, and gender dimension by putting a stronger focus on the including of persons with disabilities. And for example, the regular labor market through emerging opportunities that the Green Deal would bring about. Attention should also be paid to leave no one behind in the transition process of the economy, for example, by providing trainings and allowing provisions for reasonable accommodation measures and improving accessibility. And the last part, that the European Green Deal should not lead to improvements in Europe and at the expense of the global South, or groups in society that are already marginalized in well-being, income, access to goods and services for persons with disability. They should not be negatively impacted. So yeah, and your second question was about how the members would be involved.
Yeah, exactly.
So for us, it's really very important that within the member states, we are doing the lobbying on European level, but within the members, they really need to take the inclusive planning and the meaningful involvement, like it's stipulated in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the General Comment 7. They should be the engine above the SDGs to defend their rights. So lobby to get the consultation and the decision-making process integrally accessible, including communication and stakeholders' participation has to be inclusive, allowing also the reimbursement of all costs and adequate remuneration for disabled people to be also as experts. And second thing is also to adapt that human rights complement approach in all climatic actions. So efforts should be done really on sufficient, there must be a sufficient ambition, non-discriminatory and otherwise compliant with responsibilities of the states and under the duty barriers, including business, on the international, regional and national human rights obligations. And so why? To mitigate climate change and to prevent its negative human rights impacts. Another reason is to ensure that all persons have the necessary capacity to adapt to climate change, because we need some time to do that. Another reason is to ensure the accountability and the effective remedy for human rights when harms caused by climatic change, and also to mobilize the maximum of available resources for sustainable human rights-based development. And also we need to protect human rights from business harms. So it should not be priority, that it should be cost effectiveness, like we hear the previous speakers have said, it should not be overwhelming our basic human rights. And also we need to ensure that there is an equity in the climate actions. So I leave it now until we have the next round.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I thought that was really interesting to hear from the from a EU perspective and what EDF is doing. And I noticed that you brought forward a lot also the human rights perspective, which was something Yolanda Munoz also really highlighted. So thank you so much. Time is running. I'll pass over to Mary for the next round, and hopefully also a few questions. I see a lot of them coming through in the chat, and please keep them coming. We'll see how much we can sum up.
Yeah, I think if the panelists are okay, I might actually take some questions from the floor. I think that would be good to do. I mean, we had prepared another round of questions, but I think it's good that we integrate some of the questions. So maybe this to Elham and to Yolanda, and then anybody else who'd like to come in. It's a question from Joanna Mang from Light for the World. Do you know which of the environmental organizations at international level has already started to mainstream? I'm assuming, Joanna, you mean there include persons with disabilities in terms of mainstreaming, and which organizations could be partners for us? And the big mention of COP in November 2020, well, 2021, and also next year as well, I think is something that's on everybody's mind at the moment. So Elham and Yolanda, I might put that question to both of you if you'd like to respond.
Well, yes, this is a milestone, in fact, no, because for the first time there will be a clear entity that will address disability, no, in the upcoming COP26 in Scotland. And as I mentioned, there is no constituency on disability, and we really have to push forward to the creation of this constituency. And but at this point, we already have the caucus that is being that has been proposed, but by the UNFCCC, and this is our chance to really move forward. To make disability a priority in the dialogue on climate change, no? And it has not been easy, but I am confident that it will eventually become a constituency. The problem is that the figure of constituency is closed at this point. The UNFCCC does not want to open a new constituency. However, there is also the obligation that in this policy at the United Nations that they have to provide equal opportunities for persons with disabilities in every initiative at within the UN. So probably we could use, it will be possible to use this this policy to push forward and for the creation of a constituency and have equal opportunities for participation, but this will take years. No, it will demand a lot of work and building more solid advocacy strategies.
Thank you, Yolanda. Yeah.
Thank you so much. From my side, what I can add is in terms of partnerships, I think first of all, we can see a drastic change in attention to disability and climate change, which is fantastic. I mean, we now see that everyone is trying to become active, and this is a perfect opportunity. So of course, we need to start prioritizing DPO engagement and for supporting OPDs to get engaged in climate action, especially in climate mitigation policies, because most of the examples that we have right now is activities around impact of climate change on people with disabilities and disability inclusive disaster response, which is very important, very critical, and a must, but it's not just only, it's not the only area. And as I mentioned, we need to especially work on supporting OPDs to become active in the area of disability inclusive combat. of climate change and mitigation policies. So I think for this, the most critical thing that could be done is to encourage and establish partnerships, collaborations between disability OPDs and climate organizations. There are lots of networks and movements on the ground, especially youth network working on climate change, climate action. And if these partnerships can get started and supported, we can see that naturally climate organizations, climate movement is opening up and becoming disability inclusive, and OPDs start prioritizing disability inclusive climate action, start looking into role of persons with disabilities in climate action. So I would see this as a kind of key solution, a kind of partnership between DPOs and climate organizations. And I just want to highlight the importance of funding. I think we need to look into funding opportunities and project support for climate work, how disability inclusive they are. Are we asking for disability inclusion when we are funding climate work? And are we looking into also targeted funding for disability inclusive climate action? These are, this will be a game changer, in my opinion. Thank you so much, Mary.
Thanks, Elham. If I can just follow up with a question with you, it's from Blandine, and it's also to others, but Elham, I know that you're involved. The GLAD network of donors decided to set up a new group on climate change. How much progress are we seeing from the donors front and any champions there? And just before, we did invite Charlotte McLean from the World Bank to attend. She couldn't make it, but she's really interested to hear the wording from this video, just to send her apologies. Yeah.
Yeah, the group, the working group on climate has been established, chaired by Charlotte from World Bank, Stefan from the International Labour Organization, and myself. We now have two working groups, one on content development and another one on communication, information, and events. The groups are now have started like meeting, and then the second meeting of the group is going to be this week. In terms of funding, it has not been, mostly the conversation has been around joint, how to ensure joint position by GLAD members around climate change and disability. In terms of funding, though, there was this conversation in the content development group around developing a checklist on what funders should do to ensure that their climate funding is disability inclusive. And this is one of the materials that is going to be developed in the group. So I think Angelique kindly circulated the invitation to join that group between IDDC members, and we have many colleagues, including from HI. We have someone on board, I guess. But I want to use this opportunity to encourage other IDDC members who are interested to get involved, to get in touch with GLAD Secretariat through Angelique, and see if they can participate. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Elham. So we have two more questions, and then we might look at doing a wrap up, because we're finishing, I think, in 15 minutes. So this is a question to all of the panels, whoever would like to answer this question. How persons with disability, different disabilities, are included, e.g. in the humanitarian responses, and the example of deaf or persons with intellectual disabilities tend to be left even further behind. If there's anybody who'd like to make a quick comment to that, I know Zika, you spoke quite a lot from the Mozambique experience there, and Dr. Bhushan, you spoke from India as well, but if there's anything else anybody would like to add, please do so. Now is the time. Or not. I'll give it a minute. Okay, so we might come back to that question. We can put some notes after. The next question then is from Gordon from EDF. And this is to any of the panelists. Are organizations truly integrating disability inclusive justice into their ongoing development, DRR, humanitarian work? Or is it still being looked at as a new and separate thing to tackle sometime when there is enough interest and enough resources? Really important question, Gordon. Anybody, maybe Elham or Yolanda or any of our colleagues from IDDC that would like to respond to that?
Hooray.
Yeah, go ahead.
Bhushan, should I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Bhushan, go ahead.
Okay. I can wait for Yolanda.
Oh, do you want me to answer? Okay. Well, I mean, of course, there, as I mentioned, also, I mean, there is Global Green Grants Fund, and they have already worked on that. But I mean, humanitarian response is something that, at this point, from my experience, is still a work in progress, and it has not reached the levels that it should, you know. And for example, also going back to Malina, I cannot read in the question. I mean, deaf people in particular in Haiti have a lot of experience on what it means to find themselves in a chaotic situation with no resources, and how they had to improvise to find food, water, and everything that was available. Really, there is no. I don't know of any efficient response for humanitarian action, but in terms of prevention, of participating in environmental justice activities, defending human rights, that is what we have been focusing on. Yeah, I mean, I think that Global Green Grants Fund is the best example that I have found thus far.
Okay, thanks, Yolanda. And Dr. Bhushan, you had I think a comment to make as well. Yeah.
Actually, many countries in West Asia were charity oriented. Our approach was more welfare. Then we went for UNCR, PD, and Sustainable Development Goal, and many countries have evolved the national laws. And now we have very strong advocacy groups, which are ensuring that all disability-related matters are matter of human right. They are covered like anybody else. And because of that, a lot of strong advocacy groups, and we having the national laws and we having the guidelines. Now, a lot of initiatives on climate change are becoming inclusive. Because countries have recognized, countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, Nepal, they have realized that we have to see that the rights of people with disabilities are protected. And the climate change being a part of now human rights movement, it affects everybody. It affects people with disability, their families, their existence, their survival, their protection. So now a lot of initiatives in this part of the world are becoming inclusive. Now, if they're teaching, training the people, if they're conducting the courses, if they're refresher courses, they see that there's a component related to effect of climate change on people with disabilities. Beginning has been made, but we have a long way to go, and it needs more strong advocacy and collective groups by people in these countries to ensure that things are inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's all of our questions that have been asked, and I think just back, Gordon, to the point around the intersection of climate justice, DRR, and humanitarian. There really is, you know, that learning piece and drawing out how all of these areas intersect together and are interrelated. So we hope today that the discussion has kind of piqued your interest around kind of the whole climate perspective. And I just wanted, if there's no more questions, I might just do wrap up, and Meta, please come in also if you want to, and also panelists do some final comments. Just from, I think it's really important that we've had this conversation today. It's a starting point, and I know within IDDC, Meta, you can speak to that around, you know, how we can take this forward. But really would like to thank each and every one of the panelists for giving your time, and particularly your colleagues who came very early from Canada and New York into this. So we really appreciate your input. this is a, even for CBM Global, this is a critical piece for us that we're looking at and continue to work on, and really look forward to working with all our colleagues on this. Mette, I might maybe let you take it from IDDC in terms of kind of the next steps. I think COP has been mentioned, so we'll be looking very much at CBM Global's working around COP, so we're very happy to connect with people on that and look at how to bring that really strong kind of collective voice around that. With all of us together, as you said, Dr. Bouchan, that advocacy piece is really critical. Mette, over to you.
Yeah, I'd like to join in the gratefulness of having this session and from both all the speakers and all the great questions in the chat box. And I'm sorry that we haven't had the time simply to go through all of them. I think this speaks to an increased interest and also need for the disability movement and for IDDC to really take on this issue and build knowledge and capacity in terms of how to actually address it. And I think there has been some major events or publications or efforts on this the last year or 2 years where it has really been put forward, the link also between climate change and disability. As it is now, IDDC doesn't have a specific task group on climate change, but if there's an interest and a sum of member organizations who has an interest in this, then of course it's possible to set up a specific task group, and maybe that's something that should be put forward tomorrow when IDDC has its General Assembly, the actual governance session. But for me, representing an organization that really hasn't dealt that much with climate change and disability, I think this session has really given some great examples, both from specific countries, but also the overall policy framework, important events, and that's definitely something that we can use in our work. So that was just a comment from me in my organization.
Thanks, Mette. Yeah, anybody else from the panel want to say a quick closing remark? Again, thank you to each and every one of the panelists. We really, really appreciated all the effort and energy you've put into this session. But please, if you have some closing remarks you'd like to make quickly, please feel free to do so.
I just want to do a quick touch on the question about underrepresented groups, deaf people, people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities. Again, it is under-researched, but we can imagine, I mean, I did mention the impact of climate disasters on people with psychosocial disabilities. But one more thing that I want to highlight is barrier in access to information. And again, I'm trying to highlight the climate mitigation and participation of persons with disabilities in global, national fight against climate change. We don't have the information in accessible formats. So many people with disabilities, especially deaf people, people with intellectual disabilities, and people with deaf blindness, do not have access to the information that how they can play their role. They are not aware of the scope of the climate crisis. And that's why they are, so we need to also think about sensitizing them so that they can play the role. And also, of course, the disaster management processes are not really inclusive and accessible. That has been touched by colleagues from India and Mozambique as well. So yeah, of course, underrepresented groups are much more impacted and much less included in action. So I want to thank you and the IDDC team for this opportunity and all the participants, and really look forward to seeing some of you in COP26. I don't know if it's going to be in person or in or virtual, and for future, let's hope that for the next General Assembly of IDDC we can be together in person and touch on some of the progress that have been made since today. Thank you very much.
Great. And just lastly, we will be sending out all of the content that was discussed in the notes, and also some notes around COP21. My brain's gone remembering what number go beside it, but we will be sending that out as well at a recording of this. So a big thank you to everybody. And Dr. Bishan, I see your camera is on, so you're waving goodbye, or did you have a really quick 1 minute note to say?
I'll take only half a minute. I thought
okay, perfect.
I'll just show you some pictures that how the disaster affects, and one comment on Ilham. Ilham mentioned that we need to have the climate change inclusive. To justify that, to prove to that the government, it should be inclusive, we need to show that people with disabilities suffer more. When there's a disaster, when there's a calamity, people with disabilities have, they get lot of difficulty in surviving, in protecting themselves, and then more disability, the disabling condition. Once we establish that, then only we can demand the governments to become inclusive. Just see on the screen that how devastating these effects could be when it comes to any disaster. And this is the earthquake, this is the yesterday's cyclone. See how the organization for people with disabilities are virtually destroyed because of this cyclone. We have to justify that we need to be inclusive, and if we need to be inclusive, we need to give the examples that how people with disabilities are affected in various disasters. Thank you very much, and thanks to IDDC for inviting ICVI. We already set up a task force. It's called Climate Change Education. We'll be very happy to support anything which IDDC does in climate change. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much, Dr. Bishan, for showing us exactly a practical example which is happening at the moment in India, and finishing on that point. Very big thank you to everybody. We've had an audience that stayed with us for 90 minutes. That's really impressive in this online world. And we really look forward to staying in touch around this. And thank you all for coming and asking such great questions too. Take care all. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And a big thank you to the interpreters as well, and captioners. Thank you so much for all of your support.
Thank you, Marshall. Thank you, Monica. Nice to see you on the screen.
Thank you. Bye.